Aurora Consurgens, a detailed analysis and interpretation of its 7 parables. Aurora Consurgens, meaning rising dawn, is a medieval alchemical and mystical text attributed to an unknown author, though some scholars, including Carl Jung, speculate it could have been written by Thomas Aquinas in his later years. The text blends alchemy, Christian mysticism, and biblical allegory, presenting alchemical transformation as both a physical and spiritual process leading to enlightenment. The treatise is structured around 7 parables, each rich in symbolism and allegory, describing different aspects of the great work, the alchemical process of transforming base metals into gold, symbolizing spiritual and psychological transmutation. These parables draw heavily from alchemy, biblical wisdom literature, and mystical traditions, making the Aurora Consurgens a profound document for both alchemists and spiritual seekers. This essay explores the historical and symbolic context of Aurora Consurgens, followed by a detailed analysis of each of the 7 parables, emphasizing their significance in both alchemical and Jungian psychological interpretation. The Aurora Consurgens was written in the 12th or 13th century and contains rich alchemical symbolism framed within a deeply Christian and mystical context. The text presents alchemy as not only a physical but also a mystical and divine science, where metals symbolize aspects of the soul undergoing transformation. The work is significant for its use of the voice of wisdom, which speaks throughout the text in a poetic and prophetic tone. This wisdom is often feminized, reflecting influences from the biblical Book of Wisdom and the Song of Songs, where divine wisdom is personified. The text is thus both an alchemical manual and a mystical revelation, guiding the reader through the alchemical process of purification, death, and rebirth, a journey analogous to spiritual awakening and individuation in Jungian psychology. The 7 parables as alchemical and mystical allegories. Each of the 7 parables in Aurora Consurgens describes a different stage of the alchemical and spiritual journey, depicting the purification, dissolution, conjunction, and enlightenment of the alchemist's soul. These allegories are complex, with multiple layers of meaning, and serve as guides for inner transformation. Parable 1. The King and His Illness. The first parable describes a king who falls gravely ill and can only be cured by a magical golden elixir. His advisors search far and wide, encountering many obstacles before finally discovering the hidden medicine. Alchemical and mystical meaning. The king symbolizes the conscious self or the ego, which becomes ill due to separation from the divine or unconscious wisdom. His sickness represents spiritual crisis, existential despair, or the dark night of the soul in mystical traditions. The golden elixir is the philosopher's stone, symbolizing spiritual enlightenment and inner wholeness. In Jungian terms, this represents the beginning of individuation, where the ego starts to recognize its disconnection from the self, the totality of the psyche, and seeks healing. Parable 2. The Lion and the Unicorn. In this parable, a lion and a unicorn engage in a fierce battle, ultimately leading to a transformation through their struggle. Alchemical and mystical meaning. The lion represents earthly power, ego, and raw instincts. The unicorn symbolizes spiritual purity, divine wisdom, and the higher self. Their battle is the conflict between the material and spiritual, the ego and the unconscious. This parable reflects the negrito, blackening phase of alchemy, where internal conflict and suffering lead to transformation. In Jungian psychology, this represents shadow work, the confrontation between the conscious and unconscious aspects of the psyche. Parable 3. The 2 Birds in the Tree. This parable tells of 2 birds perched on a tree. One bird eats the fruit while the other watches in silence. Alchemical and mystical meaning. The eating bird symbolizes the material aspect of existence, desire, and attachment. The watching bird represents the higher self, divine awareness, and detachment. The tree is the axis mundi, the central axis of the soul or world. This story mirrors Hindu and mystical traditions, where the 2 birds represent dual aspects of the self, one caught in illusion, the other in divine wisdom. The goal of alchemy is to unite these aspects into a harmonious whole. Parable 4. The Fountain of Life and Death. A traveler discovers a mystical fountain where those who drink either die or are reborn. Alchemical and mystical meaning. The fountain symbolizes the alchemical dissolving agent, aqua permanens, which destroys the old self and gives birth to the new. Drinking and dying symbolizes ego death, a necessary sacrifice for spiritual rebirth. Those reborn become transformed beings, closer to divine wisdom. This parable corresponds to the albedo, whitening phase of alchemy, representing purification and renewal. In psychological terms, this is a radical shift in consciousness and perspective. Parable 5, the union of the sun and moon. The sun and moon, male and female, must come together in sacred marriage to produce the divine child. Alchemical and mystical meaning. The sun masculine and moon feminine symbolize opposites that must unite to create wholeness. This reflects the alchemical conjunctio oppositorum, union of opposites. In psychology, this represents the integration of the anima animus, inner feminine masculine aspects of the psyche. This parable represents psychological integration and inner harmony, a crucial step in individuation. Parable 6, the phoenix and its resurrection. A phoenix burns itself to ashes, only to be reborn from the flames. Alchemical and mystical meaning. The phoenix represents death and rebirth, destruction of the old self to create the new. The fire is alchemical purification and the dark night of the soul. The rebirth symbolizes completion of the great work, reaching the rubedo, red phase of alchemy. This final stage represents psychological and spiritual enlightenment, akin to Jung's concept of the self. Parable 7, the philosopher's stone. The final parable describes the philosopher's stone, the ultimate goal of alchemy, which grants eternal wisdom and divine unity. Alchemical and mystical meaning. The stone symbolizes wholeness, enlightenment, and the culmination of the spiritual journey. It is the divine consciousness realized within the soul. This represents the final stage of individuation, true integration of the conscious and unconscious into the self. Aurora Consurgens remains one of the most profound alchemical mystical texts, illustrating the inner process of transformation. Its 7 parables offer a roadmap for spiritual awakening, aligning closely with both alchemy and Jungian depth psychology. Whether approached as a mystical guide, a psychological tool, or a work of esoteric wisdom, it continues to inspire seekers on the path toward wholeness and enlightenment. Carl Jung saw Aurora Consurgens as a profound alchemical text that symbolized the psychological process of individuation, the integration of the conscious and unconscious mind leading to psychic wholeness. He extensively analyzed it in his work Mysterium Conjunctionis, 1955 to 1956, where he explored the psychological, mystical, and symbolic dimensions of alchemy. Jung believed that Aurora Consurgens described the transformation of the psyche through archetypal symbols, much like the alchemy of the soul. He saw alchemical processes as mirroring deep psychological states, particularly those encountered in analytical psychology. His interpretation of Aurora Consurgens centers around 4 main themes. Jung argued that medieval alchemists were unknowingly projecting their inner psychic processes onto their work with metals and substances. The great work, magnum opus of alchemy, which sought to create the philosopher's stone, was actually a metaphor for psychic individuation. The negrido, blackening or decomposition of the material, symbolized the dissolution of the ego and confrontation with the unconscious, shadow work. The albedo, whitening, represented purification and insight. The rubedo, reddening, or the creation of the philosopher's stone, represented the integration of opposites into a unified self. Aurora Consurgens, in Jung's view, describes this inner transformation using biblical and alchemical symbolism. One of the most significant aspects of Aurora Consurgens is the feminine voice of wisdom that speaks throughout the text. Jung linked this to the anima, the inner feminine principle in the male psyche, and in the female psyche, its counterpart, the animus. The wisdom figure, sapientia, which appears in the text, represents the divine feminine, also seen in Sophia of Gnostic tradition. Jung saw her as the anima in her highest form, the soul's guide toward wholeness. This wisdom voice urges transformation, suffering, and rebirth, paralleling Jung's concept of psychic individuation. Jung saw this as evidence that the alchemists were unknowingly dealing with the anima, the unconscious feminine force, seeking integration with the masculine principle, logos. A central alchemical theme in Aurora Consurgens is the union of the sun and moon, which Jung interpreted as the integration of opposing forces within the psyche. The sun masculine, rational, conscious, and the moon feminine, intuitive, unconscious, must unite to create the philosopher's stone, the self. This union reflects Jung's concept of the coniunctio oppositorum, sacred marriage of opposites, which occurs when the ego successfully integrates the unconscious. He saw alchemy's symbolic mystical marriage as a psychological reality, the ultimate goal of individuation. Jung also connected Aurora Consurgens to the dark night of the soul, a psychological crisis that leads to spiritual awakening. The ill king in the first parable represents the ego in crisis, unable to heal itself without engaging with the unconscious. The fountain of life and death signifies the necessity of psychological death, the breaking down of outdated ego structures. The phoenix burning to ashes symbolizes the ego's transformation through suffering and rebirth. Jung believed this reflected the painful but necessary stages of individuation, where the psyche undergoes destruction, purification, and rebirth to reach self-awareness. Jung viewed Aurora Consurgens as an unconscious psychological map created by medieval alchemists, depicting the journey of individuation. The text symbols mirror dreams, visions, and unconscious material encountered in psychotherapy. The wisdom figure, Anima Sophia, guides the soul toward enlightenment, much like the unconscious seeks to communicate with the conscious mind. The union of opposites, destruction and rebirth, reflect the deepest processes of psychological healing and transformation. For Jung, Aurora Consurgens was not just an alchemical manual, it was an esoteric blueprint for self-discovery and wholeness, still relevant in modern psychology and personal development.